Hello guys. Hello guys. Welcome to these A-Push videos. I'm so glad you're here and watching these videos as we go through World War II assignments on your Google Classroom page. I do have a copy of the assignments that I'll be referencing throughout these videos, so you guys can stay on track with me. So today we are gonna talk about Franklin Roosevelt's policies towards foreign dictators, foreign leaders, in other words, during World War II, during the Great Depression, because we do have a fight on the home front as well as a fight across the world in different countries. So let's first talk about his most famous policy, which is the Good Neighbor policy. We first hear about this policy in his inaugural address towards the other nations in the Western Hemisphere, because dollar diplomacy was not working as well because of the depression, causing many of the businesses to fail in America, and they lacked the resources to provide support for foreign operations. So he implemented this policy through different ways, different strategies all across the Western Hemisphere. So let's first talk about the Pan-American conferences. At Roosevelt's direction, the U.S. delegation at the 7th Pan-American Conference in Montevideo, Uganda, in 1933, pledged never again to intervene in the internal affairs of a Latin American country. In effect, Franklin Roosevelt repudiated the policy of his older cousin Theodore and the Monroe Doctrine. So he said, we are no longer interested in intervening in internal affairs in the Western Hemisphere countries. He personally pledged to submit future disputes to arbitration, and also warned that if a European power such as Germany attempted to commit acts of aggression against us, it would find a hemisphere wholly prepared to consult together for our mutual safety and our mutual goods. So we see these parallels between the Pan-American Conference and that delegation and the Monroe Doctrine. Cuba. Cubans has long resented the Platt Amendment, which had made their country's foreign policies subject to U.S. approval. In 1934, President Roosevelt persuaded Congress to nullify the Platt Amendment, retaining only the U.S. right to keep its naval base in Guantanamo Bay. So the Platt Amendment went very much contradictory to his aforementioned Good Neighbor policy. So Franklin Roosevelt persuaded Congress to nullify, to void, to get rid of the Platt Amendment, But the U.S. is still keeping operations at Guantanamo Bay. It's a U.S. military base in Cuba. You may have known Guantanamo Bay is where they keep terrorists. Mexico. Mexico tested U.S. patience and commitment to the good neighbor policy when its president, Lázaro Cárdenas, seized oil properties owned by U.S. corporations. Roosevelt rejected corporate demands to intervene and encouraged American companies to negotiate a settlement. So he did not want to be involved in these disputes between corporate leaders, especially in Mexico. Economic diplomacy. Helping the U.S. economy was the chief motivation for Roosevelt's policies during other foreign policy issues in his first term. Because we still need to remember, I keep stressing to you guys that during all of this, all of what we just read with Hoover and Roosevelt, the U.S. is still having a depression on its hands. And I do apologize. This is going to be a longer lecture than normal. So, I do apologize. So, he has 3 economic diplomacy strategies. 1. Recognition of the Soviet Union. The Republican presidents of the 1920s had refused to grant diplomatic recognition to the communist regime that ruled the Soviet Union. Roosevelt promptly changed this policy by granting recognition in 1933. His reason for doing so, he said, was to increase U.S. trade and thereby boost the economy. So he had reasons to employ these strategies against recognition of the Soviet Union. Of course, this caused backlash, especially with the Republicans in Congress, but he wanted to, his chief motivation was not to recognize this country as doing the morally right thing, but to increase trade and the economy of the United States. Number 2, the Philippines. As an economy measure, Roosevelt persuaded Congress to pass the Tidings-McDuffie Act in 1934, which provided for the independence of the Philippines by 1946, and the gradual removal of U.S. military presence from the islands. So he wanted to build up the Philippines' independence so he can pull the American troops back. Number 3, reciprocal trade agreements. Acting in the tradition of progressive Democrats such as William Jennings Bryan and Woodrow Wilson, President Roosevelt favored lower tariffs as a means to increasing international trade. Because remember, under Republican rule in 1920, we were highly doing a trade war, especially with Great Britain and our partners in the Western Hemisphere. So he lowered tariffs to help import and export U.S. goods, and he persuaded Congress to pass a plan suggested by the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull. Events abroad: fascism and aggressive militarism. We are going to talk about three regimes here: Italy, Germany, and Japan. So, you might be familiar with Germany, but we are going to talk about Italy and Japan. So, Italy. A new regime seized power in Italy in 1922. Benito Mussolini led Italy's fascist party, which attracted disenfranchised war veterans, nationalists, and those afraid of rising communists. Dressed in black shirts, the fascists marched on Rome and instilled Mussolini in power as the leader. Fascism is the idea that people should glorify their nation and their race through an aggressive show of force. Became the dominant ideology in European dictatorships in the 1930s. So, this is a little more interesting. We are talking about fascism and dictatorships. When we think about dictatorships today, the main country that comes to our minds is North Korea. North Korea is a fascist dictatorship. They love their leader, they love their country, and they'll show that love by force, by parades, by glorifying the leader, by all that. So imagine that with these countries in Europe in the 1930s. So the next up on our list is Germany, and we all have some idea about what happened in Germany. The Nazi leader Adolf Hitler used bullying tactics against Jews as well as fascist ideology to increase his popularity with disgruntled, unemployed German workers. So he bullied the Jews and put them in Holocaust camps, in those sort of camps. I'm drawing a blank at what they call them. Yeah, but camps such as the Holocaust, Auschwitz, during the Holocaust. So this was all going on in Germany at the time that we had our economic depression. So Japan. Nationalists and militarists in Japan increased their power in the 1920s and 1930s, and economic conditions worsened, they persuaded Japan's nominal ruler, the emperor, that the best way to ensure access to basic raw materials, oil, tin, and iron, was to invade China and Southeast Asia and thereby give Japan control over what their leaders proclaimed to be the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. So these countries were invading other countries and this was uncalled for by the League of Nations and all these countries. So we are gonna step back, and we've heard this term multiple times throughout the past 3 weeks. Isolationist. So, public opinion in the United States under Republicans in 1920s and early 1930s, and ever until the United States declared war on Japan and pushed the United States into World War II, was the fact that Americans were sticking to World War I being the war to end all wars. This was very popular. An investigating committee led by Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota bolstered this view when it concluded in 1934 that the main reason for U.S. participation in the World War was to serve the greed of bankers and arms manufacturers. So, he called that the United States should not get into this world war because they learned their lessons during the First World War. Neutrality Acts. Isolationist senators and representatives in both parties, so bipartisan support, held a majority in Congress through 1938 to ensure that U.S. policy would be strictly neutral if war broke out in Europe. Congress adopted a series of neutrality acts which Roosevelt signed with some reluctance. So we have the Neutrality Act of 1935, which authorized the president to prohibit all armed shipments and to forbid U.S. citizens to the ships of belligerent nations. Number 2, the Neutrality Act of 1936 forbade the extension of loans and credits to belligerents. Number 3, the Neutrality Act of 1937 forbade the shipment of arms to the opposing sides of the Civil War in Spain. So all these neutrality acts were aimed so if war does break out in Europe, that the United States would remain neutral. The Spanish Civil War. So things broke out in Spain. The outbreak of civil war in Spain in 1936 was viewed in Europe and the United States as an ideological struggle between the forces of fascism, led by General Francisco Franco, and the forces of republicanism called Loyalists. Roosevelt and most Americans sympathized with the Loyalists, but because of the Neutrality Acts, could not aid them. So this civil war was going on so Spanish can attack the policies, the rule of fascist dictators in Spain, but because of the Neutrality Act, the United States could not help the Spanish regain control of their land. Ultimately, in 1936, Franco's fascists prevailed and established a military dictatorship. So, this Spanish Civil War kind of failed because the Spanish was still under a military dictatorship. The American First Committee in 1940, after World War II had begun in Asia and Europe, isolationists became alarmed by Roosevelt's pro-British policies. To mobilize American public opinion against war, they formed the America First Committee and engaged speakers such as Charles Lindbergh to travel the country, warning against re-engaging in Europe's troubles. So, next lecture, they basically, when Europe first came into war, the American senators that was pro-isolationist developed a road tour across America to rally support for this pro-isolationist stand. In the next lecture, it's gonna be a shorter one. We are gonna talk about appeasement and a prelude to war. So, see you guys in the next video lecture. Come back.